I picked a section that I thought might be appropriate for this place and this event. It takes place in Eden Prairie, the place where my parents still live, the place where we just drove from. And I think that the only context that you need is that it takes place when I was in 6th grade. So forgive me for my thoughts and my observations about the world. And my number one preoccupation as a 6th grader was my hairline and how much I hated it. So that's the context that you need. I was excited by the trip. Finally, a time to feel superior and cosmopolitan in front of my yokel cousins, still trapped in what my teacher had always described with a sympathetic look in my direction as a third world country. Now that I was in 6th grade, my entire comprehension of social dynamics was formed through comparing myself to others. There was the other Asian girls in my classes, including Ming, who also went to Chinese school, and whose hair was bouncy and glossy like Monica's from Friends. There were Jody and Liz, who had cute freckles, real Abercrombie jeans, and wore their hair gelled back in high and tight ponytails because their hairlines were gorgeous. They were Korean and adopted, so the comparisons ended there. And then there was my sister, who was gregarious and cute, and I hated her for it. I made her open the front door whenever strangers knocked and pick up the phone when I didn't realize the number on the caller ID, even though I was 4 years older. And further from my circle were all the other kids in the surrounding school districts who attended Chinese school on Saturdays, nearly all of whom spoke Mandarin more fluently than I did. But I was definitely not as weird as them. These child geniuses, far more brilliant and demented than myself, including a 12-year-old boy who constructed an entire laptop computer from salvaged parts that he then brought with him to class in order to watch porn. There was also my best group of friends, Rory, Samira, Jules, and Kelsey, to whom I never really compared myself, and I never really questioned why. They loved books as much as I did, and we spent our time talking about what we read and listened to, and attempting to write a book together, for which Oprah would invite us onto her show as the youngest authors who ever lived. I say with some certainty now as an adult that these first authentic friendships changed everything for me, but at the time, those friendships were just there, comfortable, uncomplicated, undramatic, easy, and thus not interesting enough to torture myself over. I felt I had nothing to prove to them, not realizing that that was something rare and thus worthy of cherishing, and placed the entirety of my social energy elsewhere. For this trip to China, I had much to prove, and so I would wear my coolest clothes, the ones that revealed the exact right amount of midriff, the handspan. I would not be like my mom, whose clothes were both aggressively plain and kind of ugly too. 2 big t-shirts with foreign cartoon characters and unfashionable blue jeans from brands no one had heard of. I would also bring my Discman and a sleeve of burned CDs because I suspected and hoped that I'd be bored by what we would be doing, but also look forward to getting the chance to show them off. Certainly, they didn't have things like music in China. The quick flight to San Francisco was exciting, and nearly exactly what I had imagined flying to be like. Ceremonious and cinematic. I looked out the porthole window and imagined that I had a movie camera over the left shoulder, and I tried to think tender thoughts and make myself cry. But boarding the China Eastern flight in California to China was different. I couldn't understand many of the Chinese families, and they spoke loudly in dialects I wasn't even sure was Chinese. Many were traveling with elders, which was exotic in and of itself. The Chinese families I knew were other orphan families like mine, whose grandparents were visitors and spent the majority of the time keeping to themselves, lest they attract any American attention. These grandparents, as far as I could tell, were not visiting, and they didn't want or care to be invisible. Rather, they did whatever they wanted, spitting watermelon seeds directly onto the airplane carpet, lying on the pass-throughs to sleep, ignoring the dings of the seatbelt reminder, as well as the Chinese flight attendants who tried to get them back into their seats. These were Chinese people behaving like they didn't care what other people thought of them, something I had never seen before, and I felt something sharp unglue inside me. I closed my eyes, lulled by the vacuum noise of the plane. When I opened them again, it was somehow the next day, and we were about to land. Nothing good could come next. Ching's sister and her husband met us at the airport, and Ching embraced me and cried. I did not hug anyone because no one hugged me, and it was excruciatingly awkward to realize I could not say any of the things in Mandarin that I thought one was supposed to say during homecomings like these. I'm so happy to be home. You haven't changed at all. Both because I didn't know the words, but also because they were not the truth. Our luggage was swept up by the adults, and I scrambled to help so I wouldn't have to say anything, and then we were on our way. in a van driving alongside a freeway that looked like what freeways look like. But the sky we drove underneath was unlike anything I had seen before. It was the same color as our home, a beige yellow gray, the sun a suggestion of light, a color almost red instead of luminescence itself. China was nothing like what I had imagined. G9 was bigger than any city I had ever been in, and dirtier too, which scared me, since I only knew Chinese people to be neat freaks. And though the inside of my relatives' apartments were spotless, I was astonished by the things they had. Decorative urns taller than my father on his tiptoes, marble floors I could almost see my reflection in, fancy televisions that were larger and flatter than anything I had seen inside my friends' homes. Are they rich? I asked Ching, who shrugged. So are we poor? She glared at me. I stayed mostly mute as my parents made the rounds visiting friends and old co-workers, hoping that I could use my silence to my advantage to appear more mysterious or even sophisticated. We went out to restaurants the size of department stores and ate in individual rooms around massive circular tables that could seat 20 with lazy Susans the circumferences of hula hoops. And there were lots of people who wanted to treat my parents to dinner, and it felt strange to see my parents as social and popular people, though they absolutely did not behave like they were popular. They were still unsure, and at some points even seemed cowed by it all. What happened to you, Ching? Her friends would jibe. Trying to appear modest for us? She'd smile and blink in the same way she would during my parent-teacher conferences. My silence, too, didn't come across as enigmatic, but rather as strange and doltish. I didn't know how to explain the question, what's it like in America? How could I explain? It was boring. Maybe it was less dusty. China seemed like one gigantic sprawling city, which meant the America I knew was basically the countryside. School was easy, Chinese school was hard. I settled on saying, the sky is blue, which seemed effective since at least it elicited a smile.
Oh, good idea. Your approach. Well, Connie, what I love about your writing is you constantly are putting yourself out there and showing how wrong you are about so many things.
Everything I just read I was wrong about,
Right.
It turns out. Yeah.
So you're born in China, raised in the U.S., including, right here in the Minneapolis area, Eden Prairie. How did going back to China change your perceptions of what it means to be Chinese and how you thought about your own place in this world?
I don't think I really understood much about what it meant to be very specifically Chinese, mainland Chinese American, until I actually learned about the history of this wave of Chinese immigration to America. I think what we learned in school was Chinese Americans came over to construct the railroads, right? They came through Angel Island, they settled in San Francisco, they made their way across the country, and that version of Chinese America just never made much sense to me. I felt about as close to that history and those people as I felt about any other, version of America. The Mayflower, exactly. It was not the Chinese America that I knew. And it wasn't until I was actually doing research for this book that I finally sat down and really dug into the history, and it was apparent that the Chinese American culture that I knew was really based off of the sort of wave of immigration that my father was part of, in which people came to the U.S. for post-secondary education, for higher education, specifically in fields that could translate, which meant science and engineering. And so most of those students obviously valued education, they valued studying, they valued a very specific way of life, and they saw those things as the key to being able to access the things that America had to offer. And those people who chose to stay rather than go back to China with what they've learned are also a type of person, right? They are a little bit of they go against the grain, but a little bit of iconoclast, especially the women, and that's something I explored in the article I wrote for the New York Times about mothers of Connies, Chinese American Connies especially. They've got a brave streak, they've got a rebellious streak. It takes a lot to be able to uproot your entire life and move to a different country when you have the means and the experience and the skills to sort of make it in your home country. You can kind of imagine what kind of person that's like. So growing up, I didn't know any of this stuff. I was just like, oh, my parents, yeah, we were kids. But of course, I was like, they're so focused on education and studying and these things, and I didn't have any context for why. But now it makes a ton of sense.
Mm-hmm. And when we think of immigration, we typically think that this is an act that people do by choice. but of course your parents did not choose to spend the rest of their lives in the United States. Tell us about what their situation was, how they came to be immigrants.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to put too much words in their mouth, although I kind of say this a little bit after writing a book about it, so sorry. You know, but the plan was always for my dad to get his PhD degree and then move back to China. My mom came here to visit him for, I think, like a year, 2 years tops. She brought 2 suitcases, and then Tiananmen Square happened. My father participated in some solidarity protests, and anyone, I think, when we look back on Tiananmen Square, we kind of see the end of it. But I don't think a lot of us realize just how it started and how positive and optimistic it was in the very beginning. It was a student movement, you know, and it was about knowledge and sort of this optimism that students had for this new China. And of course, it turned very deadly. So participating in protests in the beginning felt fairly low stakes. And of course, it turned out to be very high stakes. And then through a series of events, it became very apparent that it wasn't really safe for them to move back to China. Of course, they could if they wanted to. They did the cost-risk analysis and realized that it was better to stay. So my mom had those 2 suitcases with what I unkindly refer to as ugly, outdated clothes. But those are the clothes she came with, and those are the clothes that she had to sort of like reimagine her entire life, kind of, again, like without her consent, really. You know, she came here on vacation, and she got stuck.
How do you think this shaped just how they viewed their experience in the United States?
Yeah, I think that the possibility that disaster is around the corner is very real. I think for a lot of immigrants, and so the sort of like fear and preparation for disasters,
Like preppers.
like preppers, exactly. It's sort of the prepping mentality. It's just like the worst case scenario. Like, do you acknowledge it? Are you prepared for it? Like, it's going to happen. So like I gave this example in the book, but it's like when I was looking for where to live in Los Angeles, my mom was like, well, the most important thing to think about is snakes in the wall. She had seen, I think, maybe some videos of like snakes coming out of walls. Like, doesn't matter where it was, but like she's like, that is something that can happen. It's happened to someone. It can happen to you. So like that's a silly example, but like that disaster mentality, I think, is yeah, it's something that connects a lot of us.
And we should say that Mrs. Lee and Mr. Wang are right here in the audience, as is your 3-year-old son Mark. So I just want to give a shout out to your incredibly supportive family and the most well-behaved toddler I've ever seen.
I'm really, really proud of him. I'm also very grateful for my parents for coming. Thank you. Also, good job, Mark.
It's also worth noting that your mom, I mean, it's maybe not so surprising given your career and how far you've come as a published author, but your mom had a very successful career in China as well in editing. You know, as you came to understand her better through the writing of this book, I mean, did you or did she ever see her life as sad because she had to give up so much? And again, it was not an act by choice of her coming here and staying here and having to start everything over here in America.
Yeah. I think the origin of this book was me, again, wrongly assuming sadness, you know. During the pandemic, which is when this sort of book kind of happened, my mom and I were sharing a lot of like books that we were reading and exchanging, like as everyone was doing, you know. And I was passing along a lot of memoirs and nonfiction that I thought she might relate to, and there was a lot of immigrant stories. At one point, I think after the 3rd one, she was like, "You need to stop." I was like, she's like, this is too depressing. Like, these are such sad, traumatic stories, and I don't want to feel more sad right now. She's like, but it makes sense. Like, all publishers want from us immigrants is like stories about us suffering. She's like, isn't that what they want? And that made me so sad. And I thought about our life in the way that I sort of saw the trajectory of our life, and then my mom's life too, as sort of a series of suffering, and the lack of suffering that I have is a sort of like direct connection to her having suffering. And I was like, well, if she doesn't see it as suffering, it's so unfair for me to see it that way. What does it look like to see our lives, and her life in particular, as a series of adventures? And that's the attempt was this book.
You write in the intro of this book, to write about your mom, especially if it's your job is to write, is to reveal that you have nothing much to write about in the first place. Which I think we all know that in your case that's absolutely not true. But why do you think you keep coming back to your mom as a subject of your writing?
I think the first story I wrote was probably about my mom, like in first grade when you're like, making up stories. Probably the last story I wrote has something to do with my mom, certainly that's true. I think it's because my mom's perspective on things is so strange and unique, but also like surprising that I always learn something from it, and I always remember it because I've never heard that perspective before. And so when anything happens in my life, like I say, like my mother moments in my life, I always think like there's always something that I remember her saying that just like is playing in the background. And because of that, it's like it will forever shape the way that I move through this world. And that's why I keep returning to it, because like, saying something my mom said or reminded me or like, whatever. It's not like the most generic sort of take or commentary on anything. It's always the wildest ones. And I think that has to be why, that she's just got such a strange and unique and wonderful perspective on things that I can't help but revisit it all the time.
That's really sweet. It's also worth noting that you gave your mom chain editing power. I mean, she was the very first person to read every chapter that you wrote in this book. And that's such a departure, I think, from most memoirs. I mean, I'm just thinking of the ones that I've read in recent years. I think like the writing of the book actually probably led to more estrangement from the family. So why was it important for you to collaborate with your mom in writing this memoir?
Yeah. I get this question a lot, I think, because it's different than the way that a lot of people write memoir, and I understand why it's different, because writing memoir is not easy. It's quite a personal experience, obviously. It involves a lot of just like soul searching, revisiting really awful events, and digging into like the blackest parts of your memories. But the way that I felt like I could do that was to do it with someone else. And I think that I couldn't write about myself without writing about my mom, and I felt like it wasn't kind to do it that way, and it wasn't respectful, and it also just like wasn't, it wasn't fair to tell her story without her involvement. Also, it didn't quite make sense because like she is probably one of the better editors that I know.
Right.
Like she's like this is her thing. She knows, first of all, she knows her life better than anyone else, but also she knows the bones of editing, what makes a good story, and how to tell those stories. Also, she was living with me during the time because it was the pandemic and I had a new baby, and so it was also extremely convenient to do that. I won't say it was like a totally pleasant experience all the time. Some of those conversations were like not great, but I'm really happy that we had them.
What wasn't great about it?
Oh my gosh, can you imagine?
It's just like therapy, like many hours of therapy.
It's talking about like why someone had a certain memory and why another person had a different memory, and why someone saw something as positive and someone saw something as negative, and just talking about things that you never imagined you could talk to your mom about. But we did it, and we survived. And and then it also helps to go back and revisit it and re-edit it and like go through the words and put things on paper, because I think for anyone who writes a lot or even writes a little bit, that like when you put something down on paper, it loses a little bit of the power over you. Being able to communicate some thoughts and sort of like feelings that you have that feel really too big. It makes it much more manageable. So being able to do that with someone else is like, you just took the teeth out of it.
Yeah. And how did your writing and researching of this book just shape your understanding of her? Because I think it's natural, it's human nature, for many, even decades, to just think of your mom as your mom and not really think of her as an individual beyond motherhood.
Yeah.
So what did you learn from her?
Everything. Just like I even when I started writing the book, I was like, oh, I know how she felt about certain things, or I know how she remembers certain things, and again, I was wrong. So, I think that the specific story of when we came to America, why she decided to stay, there were also things that were happening because I was so pregnant and also, just gave birth during that time. where I think there was like a story that my sister had said that, you know, my mom hadn't gone to the, go see a doctor when she was pregnant until she was way into her second trimester. My sister was always like, that seems so strange. Like, why would mom not do that? She's so, you know, particular about going to the doctor. Now it makes a lot of sense. She didn't want to confront the idea that she had a second child when China had a one child per family policy, you know. Also, no health insurance, you know, like there's a lot of things that go, and those are things I never thought about as a young person. And it wasn't until I was going through it myself and I was so obsessed with going to my doctor and being like so on top of things that I was like, oh, the things that must be present in your life and the circumstances that must be like that were, like, it just didn't make any sense until that moment, which is such a selfish thing to say, you know, you don't care until you go through it yourself. But it also, this process made me realize that there's just so much more in my life I haven't experienced that she has, that I have to look forward to.
Yeah, what a gift. That's really incredible. Something that's very common between immigrant parents and their kids is a language barrier. And you say that you speak Chinese as poorly as she speaks English. So you've settled on, in your words, carefully honed Chinglish. How did not having a shared fluency in a single language affect this mother-daughter relationship?
I think a lot of people who don't have this experience with their parents, like, just cannot wrap their heads around it. It's like, I think that the best way I can explain is like the overlap in our language is maybe 15%. It's like the very bottom 15% of your vocabulary is what you can communicate with, and then the very bottom of theirs is what you can understand. And like, yikes, right? But I think that the great thing about it is that the expectation is that we always have to try. And I think that with a lot of people who don't have that expectation, it's just like, it's a given. Like, you understand, you don't understand. Like, the sort of understanding is a thing that exists, it's a state, rather than an expectation that you constantly have to do it. So for us, it's like, we understand each other on so many levels, but we never fully understand each other, just on a very literal level, right? And so that act of understanding has to be continuous. And I think that is also like a really wonderful thing that we have that a lot of people would see as probably a detriment to a relationship.
And so you think writing this book brought you closer, it sounds like?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
You know, it also took us apart sometimes, and then it brought us closer together after, you know.
Yeah.
But I think this was a good thing for us to have done.
Yeah, very great for both of you, I would say. You know, you lived in New York City and now LA, and I just love how you describe your childhood hometown of Eden Prairie, because I'm also a product of the suburbs, and I never thought in a million years that I could write about something such a deeply personal and hilarious way as you did. I mean, just tell me, like, what it was like to grow up there, and how did that shape you as a person, a human being, and a writer?
I think there's a lot of Eden Prairie people in the audience, and I think that, like, I realize now, having lived in many more places that are very different from Eden Prairie, like how magical Eden Prairie actually is and was. But I think growing up there, it was so safe, and it was so stable, and it was just like, there was no bullying that I like ever experienced. There was no like drama. There wasn't really crime. It was just like, this is just quite. Right? It was so very beige. I think that when I was like even writing my college essays, I was like, literally nothing's happened to me. But that's not true, of course. But like, I was like, nothing has happened. Like, nothing has happened to me. And now I come back to it, and it's like, like color-wise, aesthetically, it like homes are certainly very beige, you know. But also like Eden Prairie itself has changed so much. Like, we were just like, the first place we went after they picked me up from the airport was the Asia Mall.
Oh, do you have the hot pot?
Oh, and, no, we didn't. We ate at the first story, the Keto like restaurant at the ground story, and I mean, like 20 years ago, we were like, "There's going to be an Asian Mall." I would have been like, "No, there's not." You know,
With like not one but two bubble tea places.
exactly. There's like robots who will deliver you your food, and it was packed. You know. And that's just like one aspect of the way that Eden Prairie has changed. Like, I go into places now and it's incredibly diverse. Like, my dad runs a Kumon Learning Center in Eden Prairie, and it's like the diversity within the student body is like, just, it takes my breath away. It's like, it's amazing. So the capacity for like places to change is just as awesome to me as the capacity for people to change too. And I have such fondness for Eden Prairie, even though I don't think I'm ever gonna come back here and live here. But
You never know.
you never know. But it's like a place I always like look forward to coming back to because it is really quite special.
I think you told me too, when I interviewed you for the Star Tribune, that it was just a place where you could ride your bike and not have a care in the world and just play with sticks in the forest. I mean, those are just things that, sometimes we take for granted, but it gave you a chance to be a kid.
There's no fences.
What's that?
There's no fences in Eden Prairie. I think that's a homeowners association sort of situation. No, it's not.
It is just purely how, because we moved here from a place that did fences, and we were a little surprised, but we weren't gonna put up a fence if nobody else did. It was just so kids could play. It's hard to get.
It's not an HOA thing.
No, there really isn't an HOA.
Well, there's no fences, and that says a lot to me. I have a
They need
fence
to
in
work
my
this into
place.
their, Visitors Bureau slogan.
For Money Magazine,
Best place to live in America.
And I have a fence in LA, and I put it up so my kid could run around, and I could feel a little bit secure. But I was like, that's so strange. I never, the idea of a fence to me in Eden Prairie was just so foreign, I biked everywhere, and I babysat kids when I was too young to be babysitting. That sort of freedom and responsibility that we had as young people was really great, and I'm so lucky that was my childhood.
One thing you didn't write about in the book was your interviews with Connie Chung, and I have to tell you, and I've told you this before, but I mean, that was the most artful essay on representation and motherhood I've ever read, and you're just such a gifted writer. Tell us just how this whole idea came about.
So I wrote for the New York Times this opinion piece about the sort of phenomenon of Asian women named Connie of this generation, and I looked into the numbers, and for a 15-year period of time, the name Connie was really declining in popularity. Literally no one was named Connie who was born between 1980 and 1995, except for the years that Connie Chung was on TV, which makes sense, but it was almost exclusively Asian American women being named Connie. So when I was writing this book, I was reaching out to sort of people who confirm certain things to give me additional perspectives on things, and I cold emailed Connie Chung just maybe. She got
What was
back
the
to me.
pitch? What did you say in the email?
Well, I think it was a pretty stunning premise. I was like, did you know there's thousands of people named after you? And not just named after you, but literally they will say that they're named after you. Because I thought that was a really special thing about me. I would go around and be like, I'm named after Connie Chung. And I think for people who aren't Asian, they'd be like, oh, really? That's cool. But I would say that to another Asian Connie, and they'd be like, yeah, me too. We all are. And so I had a conversation with her. She was so crass and amazing and smart and thoughtful and sharp, and it was the best hour of conversation I think I've had with someone I was supposed to be interviewing, and then I had this story, and just I just held on to it for a long time, and I think that when I wrote about it earlier this year, I think there was a lot of stories, sad stories about representation, sort of disappointing stories about representation. I was like, I actually have a story about representation. It's just it's a feel-good story that, I don't know, there doesn't seem to be a bummer aspect about it. And so the Times took it, and they photographed a bunch of Connies with the Connie Chung. I wasn't there.
Weren't you there? I was going to ask you that.
Well, I was in LA, and the budget department.
Oh, no. The New
I
York
know.
Times couldn't fly you out there.
But I got to listen in on the phone. It wasn't really a comparable situation, but it's still, I saw the video afterwards, and I was crying. My mom and I watched it together. We were both oh, this was such an emotional, cathartic thing for Connie's. But to answer your question, I think that people who named their kids Connie were typically the moms, and they were typically moms who saw Connie Chung on TV and was moved by it, right? Being in America, not seeing a lot of Asian faces, and then also seeing an Asian face who was in such a position, asking such critical questions to important people, and doing it with such style. She was a really stylish lady, but also bravery and I think intensity, and being this is what I want for my daughter, and then choosing to name them after Connie. I think that
You picked your own name.
I did. I'm so thankful I didn't pick my other favorite TV people at the time, which was like Michelangelo from Ninja Turtles, or like Elmo or something. But I think Connie was the one that I wanted, and my parents were both like, "That's
Go
a
for it. Yeah.
that's a good choice."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did Connie Chung tell you what it was like to kind of claw her way up to the top of a very white male-dominated industry?
Oh yeah, I think the way that she said was, she was like, getting into the door was put easy, because when she started, it was the very beginning of broadcast television, and they knew that they wanted people who were representative of the demographic, because it was very obvious, right? You couldn't hide behind a byline. And so at the time, in the late 60s, there was a sort of like boom in diversity hiring, which I think was very like almost analogous to what we experienced in the past like 5-10 years. But she said that that was the easiest part about it, and then it was just a struggle from the moment she was hired. She was the only person in the room, and not just the only Asian person in the room. She was the only the only woman in the room, you know. And she said that she always felt it, you know, and people always made sure she felt it until the very end. Yeah.
Wow, she was a legend. And then when you finally get hold of all these other Asian Connies, or your generation Connies, you called it, were there any similarities that you all had?
Yeah, we loved our moms.
Yeah.
You know, we all had such respect for our moms. I think that a lot of the Asian Connies were from that like immigration demo that I talked about earlier, with parents who came over for education, and so a lot of us were raised in the same sort of ways, to prioritize education, to prioritize like sort of stable career paths. But of course, like a lot of us had moms who were kind of weird. Were a little bit arty, you know, like a lot of them came from journalism backgrounds, from art backgrounds, from editing backgrounds, and so almost like half of them went into maybe very typical sort of like career paths, and then the other half of us were just like wacky, and I thought that was really cool. Like they all felt like they could take risks, sort of like hold leadership positions, like do things because there was a Connie who had done it before, even though it's kind of like a, you know, this is a Connie that none of us ever thought we would ever meet. But it felt like there had been a Connie who had been that Connie, and so like we could also do it, you know.
Yeah.
It had been done before.
Wow, that's really fascinating. So do you keep in touch? Is there like a sisterhood now that you have?
There was like a WhatsApp group from some of the Connies that has recently died out. But Connie Chan just emailed me like a week ago
She
to say
did?
something, and I was like, oh my god.
Can you share what she said?
That story actually won an award, and so she was the first person to reach out before the editor of the Times even. She reached out. She was like, congratulations. And I was like, yeah, she's great.
That's amazing. What award did it win?
An ONA award.
Oh yeah, that's a big deal. Online News Association used to be known as that. And at the heart of this essay is, I think, the dreams that mothers have for their daughters, and how something like a name can really encapsulate those dreams. What would you say your mom's dream for you was, or is?
I think to not be bullied, not by bullied by people is beside the point. To be bullied by ideas, by systems, by structures, to sort of like do what it is that I want, to feel really good about it. And I hope I'm living my life as closely to that principle as I possibly can. But also to do it with a lot of responsibility, I think, because it's not just, you know, me in this world existing by myself. To be able to do that depends on a lot of other people as well, and I have to be mindful of that. Is that right?
This has been fantastic. We should open it up to the audience for questions. If any of you have a question, please just stand up and
Did
say
Mindy
your question.
Kaling reach out to you yet to do
Mindy
a show?
Kaling?
Yeah.
Mindy Kaling?
That's really nice. There is a strike happening, so.
I know,
nothing
but
like
if you
that.
could be one of those shows,
Oh, thank you.
totally.
Well, you should ask my mom later if she has ideas of who should play her.
Yeah.
All right.
Any other questions?
You know, I thought it was funny. She's gonna say her wish is you having a kid, because that's what all Asian mom does.
I never felt pressured by my
Oh,
mom
wow.
about that.
I certainly got pressured.
Yeah. I did have a kid. As you
No,
can see.
I had a
But-
kid at the same time you did. That's
Oh,
why.
you did?
Yeah,
Oh,
in
yeah.
2020 September.
Yeah, no, but that's one good thing about, I mean, not one good thing, among many, but I think my mom is not like a lot of other immigrant moms in that way, that because she sees the world in such a very strange, unique way, like I said, I think that she also doesn't expect any of us to sort of like do things just because that's the way you do things. You should only do things if you really want it, otherwise that never ends up well, I think. Yeah.
You went to Cedar Ridge for at least, yeah. Do you remember, did you ever publish a little book with the Pinecone Press?
Yes.
Did you keep it?
I bet I did. I don't know where in the basement it is, but I do. Yes, I do remember the Pinecone Press.
My daughters from
Really?
there, and we just pulled them out over Christmas and read them. It's worth doing. They're so funny.
It's so funny. That one part of the sort of memoir process I just couldn't bring myself to do was read my old diaries, things I wrote
Oh.
back that I just couldn't. I mean, I remember enough of just how bad my perspectives and thoughts were. At the time, I was like, I don't really need to confirm it.
You didn't think that there was like this, child genius. If you had to go to explore your old diaries, you would see how brilliant you were
No,
as
I-
a budding writer.
And I in the very early days of this book process, my book agent, when I were talking about it, she was just like, I really think that people would be interested in just how creepy a child you are. And I'm like, oh. It's like my agent thinks that. Oh, okay.
That is amazing though. I mean, I always find memoir writing so fascinating because the details are so, in your book as well, it's just so vivid. I mean, you never once turned to research old.
A lot of
old
it's on the
work.
internet.
Oh, really?
Right, so starting in high school, I could access my live journals and diary lands and things, and I did read some of those.
Okay.
But I did not read the actual diaries. I also didn't keep very many diaries actually as a kid. But the memories that I had, the things that went into the book, those are the things that I'm falling asleep, and then a memory will just wake you, blast through your brain, and you're like, oh no, I'm gonna spend the next hour thinking about why I said this when I was in 7th grade in this sort of situation, and this is now my anxiety for the rest of the night. So those are the things that I remember and went into the book. Yeah.
Do you think you have another book in you?
No.
No.
Sorry, Dad. Maybe. Never say never, right? But at this time, I think I got what I needed to get out. And also, this is a very long, excruciating process that I need a break from.
Yeah.
Do you, where else do you write for now, today?
I freelance.
You're all freelance, okay.
Yeah.
So you said Refinery, you worked,
Refinery 29, I was there for a while.
yeah, which I love that, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I know that writing for the Times and stuff, my friend is a business writer, Joe Nacera, and he's written a couple books, and it's not easy.
It's not easy, but it's fun when you get
Yeah.
into a good beat, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mr. Holmes?
Pardon?
I'm just curious,
Oh, sorry.
you hung out with a pretty fabulous group of people.
I did.
What other things were you involved in school besides studying, besides?
Well, my friends, Samira's here actually, who are calling, and Allie, who I met a year later, so you didn't make it into that passage, but you show up later. When I did volleyball until everyone got much taller than I did. I did speech, competitive speech for many years. I also played piano sort of against my will. I was quite good at piano, but I think I hated playing the piano, but I really enjoyed being very good at something, but I really hated it, which is
It's very conflicted.
very conflicted, but very good lesson for me about it's not worth it. But those are the things I did. I also worked at Payway Asian Diner.
Oh, wow. That's still around?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's in the same location, and it's also in various airports throughout the country. And I hung out with my friends a lot, which I think is now that I look back on, I'm like, that should have taken up a lot of time. Should have probably taken up more of my time, honestly. And I did a lot of interneting in high school. I wrote a lot, like I was in a lot of like groups and forums and things, and I think that during the dial-up internet days, that was such a core part of my identity and my time, and it sort of like led me down the career path that I went down. But like, thank you to my parents who like just decided that they will never have a phone call again after 4 p.m. because I was just online.
The dial-up. How did you get into journalism?
Well, because I got into blogging, and so I kept blogs all through high school and college, and then when I graduated, I decided that, well, I didn't decide, I realized that someone would pay me to do this, and so I ended up blogging for Refinery 29. My first job title was blog editor, and that ended up being like moving down into a journalism path, because blogging is basically just like journalism without any reporting.
Good foundation of the writing. I mean, you're a very great writer, and I think, like, I don't know, sometimes it's hard to teach, just.
Blogging really teaches you how to write small and write short and write like directly to an audience with a lot of voice, and I think that like that's what I came up with, and that's how I sort of like that's my favorite kind of writing to read. And then journalism is just making sure that you're not lying. You're just telling the truth.
There are other things related to it, but yeah.
That's right, yeah.
That's
a very
important
key part.
tenet. You also have this other very fascinating skill. You are an amazing packer. So, not a Green Bay Packer, but she actually can pack everything, all of her necessities into like one carry-on. So, what are your tips for packing?
Make sure that everything you bring matches with everything. So like stick with one color palette, I think, is like the big important thing. And then also never bring more than one pair of shoes, and then wear a pair of shoes too. But like, just if you can stick to one pair of shoes for your entire trip, in your suitcase, like you're golden. It sounds really extreme and tough, but like you rarely need a third pair of shoes. But if everything matches with one another, you can get like many, many different outfits out of that. Like on my trip here, Mark had half a suitcase, and then I had the other half, and we did it.
That's really incredible. Any other questions?
Did you always think that you would write a book, or like how did you come to doing that?
Did you always think you would write a book?
No, I never thought I would write a book. Mostly because like the idea of writing that many words was just like it's unfathomable. Like still I can't believe that came out, But I think that I spoke to a couple of people, and I had a really lovely agent who was very, very encouraging about it. And a lot of people said that there was some value in this idea, that they bullied me into it. Sorry, Mom. They bullied me into it, but then I was really grateful for what happened and the experience that I had afterwards. But yeah, no, it wasn't something that I wanted to do, but I'm happy that I did it.
I'm also really glad that you decided to follow your mom's advice and not make it really about, all suffering, because it just shows there's another dimension to the immigrant experience, and for the children of immigrants that, there's just this humanity and multi-dimension, I guess, in our experience. It doesn't have to be, like when you were saying earlier, do I have a story to tell, or like when you're writing your college essay. I think a lot of us think we have to like discuss how, very painful or traumatic experiences that we may have encountered, but there's so much beauty and joy and adventure in your book.
Thank you. And I also think that seeing things as adventures, of course, like to have an adventure means that there is a point in that story where you don't think it's going to end up well, and if you only concentrate on that part of it, that's just trauma, right? And that's just like living within trauma all the time, and that becomes your story. So I choose to more focus on the sort of hilarious moments of it, the what happens next, and sort of what you learn from those things to make sure it doesn't happen again. Yeah. Thank you all for coming.
Go right to the book signing if that's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
It was great.
Flat.